Welcome back to the UX Coach podcast. I'm Andy Parker, and this is the show that explores design and research careers in digital industries. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Bradley Orego. Brad is a user researcher, an experienced designer, entrepreneur, and professional dancer, currently located in Brooklyn, New York. We talked about the parallels in the digital product industry and creative arts, how the education sector is struggling to develop the career paths of Gen Z, and I ask how you continue to develop your own skills once you reach a senior level of experience. Let's get on with the show. Brad, thank you very much for joining us on the UX Coach podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, looking at your bio, you list yourself as being a user researcher, an experienced designer, entrepreneur, and a dancer based in Brooklyn, New York. Is that right?
Yes, that's all currently correct.
First off, why don't you tell us what you're doing right now?
Sure. So as of 4 days, I guess 5 days ago now, just joined a company here in New York City called 1010 Data. It's sort of a big data analytics platform. We work with a lot of financial institutions, a lot of retail companies as well, where we're sort of ingesting all of their data, letting them do some analyses on that, and then helping them make business decisions. So I joined this company as the first research hire for 1010. They've been around for about 15 years and have sort of shifted their focus now to be more user centric and more sort of product focused. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of the first hires in that direction of, hey, we should get better at doing research and at capturing these insights. So I'm here to build out that practice and sort of figure out what is research at this organization, how do we scale it across the entire organization, and also to sort of lead. There's a nascent UX team here as well, a few designers, engineers, and people doing research. And I'm here to build that team out and then sort of do this other research thing as well. So it's really exciting. It's a great opportunity. I'm really looking forward to helping this company sort of mature and to level up in that sense. And there's every single person I've talked to so far, they're like, oh, we're so happy you're here. Like everyone's really excited that there's now a researcher in-house. So it's great.
That's cool. And is this the first time that you've taken on this type of challenge of being the researcher of one and building things out?
It's certainly not the first time I've been, UX team of one. I think a lot of my career has sort of and has been built on that. And we can certainly dive into how I got to where I am now. But I've many times been research team of one and had to figure out okay, how do we operate with just one person? How do we get the most bang for our buck in a way? This is one of the first few times I've really been tasked with building out a team and building out what does this look like across the organization. I've done it at a smaller scale at a few other companies, but this is sort of, we're in the big leagues now, which is exciting.
Right. So with the challenges that you're facing today, what do you think makes a good lead researcher?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think on one hand, obviously you have to have sort of the right background and experience, and you have to understand, so here's a perfect example. Yesterday we had one of our solutions architects come to me because he's like, oh, I've been asked to put this survey together. Could you help me? And I said, of course. So he sat down, he said, here's my draft. And the first thing that I said was, okay, how many people are we sending this survey to? What are what are we trying to get out of this? What are the sort of business goals? What questions are we trying to answer? Because those two questions are going to drastically impact on what's our timeline, right? So those things will affect what we ask and what methods we use, and sort of it really guides the discussion around what the research actually is. I think that it's very much just research strategy, but I think that's something that you sort of pick up over time, and that's when I think about what differentiates maybe a senior researcher from a junior researcher. It's asking those types of questions, making sure you're doing the right research to answer whatever business or product questions you have. That's sort of purely on the skill side. I think you need to have that, and then there's this other sort of it's interesting, looking at my career and my life in performing arts and in dance, because I've had people look at me and say, you're going to be a director someday. And I look at them like, well, what do you mean? They said, you have opinions. There are a lot of people that I think you need to, in order to be an effective lead, You need to have opinions on how things should be done. You need to, be willing to sort of fight for and have discussions around, is this the best way to do that? And, are we maximizing value? Is this, the best method, et cetera? I think those sort of two things of having the background, having the knowledge, and then having the ability to, have those conversations and lead people in a way, but also be opinionated about the work that we do.
With your example there, you said about the person came to you with a survey. So
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying is that it is the going back to the question of what is it that you wanted to learn about to determine whether that particular tool is the right thing to use in this context.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say about the becoming, the potential of becoming a director, because I was reading some of your posts and I would like to hear more about performing design.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the posts that you've written there are about choreography, and I wonder whether the idea of being a user researcher or a user experience designer is a little bit closer linked to being a choreographer rather than necessarily a director of a company.
It's a really interesting question. I think I'll answer that sort of question first, and then talk more about performing design.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is certainly a level of choreography that goes into conducting research, right? This is one of the things that's really interesting to me. Like, what are the rituals around research? What are the things that we do? What are the things the methods and the whatnot? I think it is something that is fairly ritualized, but we haven't, as a sort of, as an industry, as a practice, we haven't recognized and codified those rituals, right? So we do, we all send screeners, we all send recruitment emails. We all, when you're bringing somebody in to do a user test, there's like, okay, there's the briefing, and then there's the actual test, and there's the facility. Like, there's all these things that we all kind of do, and we maybe do it slightly differently, but there's a certain, there are a lot of interesting parallels between putting on a performance and, conducting research. So I think, um, I don't know if I would necessarily look at it as like, okay, this is more choreography, this is more directorship. But I do think there are a lot of interesting parallels, and that's sort of what has led me to, kicking off this little, eventually will be a podcast. So I'd love to like pick your brain about how you're doing this. But now a good friend of mine, but a colleague of mine, Timothy Gilligan, here in New York City, I met last year at our Service Design Jam, which is like this annual event that happens globally. New York has one, obviously. He and I just sort of, we met at this event, and he has a background in theater and in performing arts. So he's trained at NYU as an actor, and has worked in the theater industry as a producer, as a sort of, he's run the gamut of things in theater. And he learned that I was a dancer, and we sort of started having this conversation of like, well, that's interesting. Like, how do you sort of? It actually started off as, how do you bring your whole self to work, right? Like,
Right.
we have this other training and this other background and this life in performing arts, but he's now a design practice manager at Capital One. And it was like, okay, so how do we like unite this tech design research world and this performing arts world? And for me, I was like, that's a really good question. I don't really, at the time, I hadn't really thought about it. So that's sort of the genesis of it, and where we are now. So it's been about a year. We've been sort of thinking about it and working on it a little bit here and there. Is that we've come up with what we're calling sort of a framework. It's not necessarily prescriptive. It's really just areas of interest and things that sort of overarching ideas of like, these are definitely concepts that people, I think they're a little bit more fleshed out in the performing arts world. How do we take some of those things and apply them to the work that we do in tech, the work that we do in design? What can we learn essentially from the performing arts world?
Mm.
So it's a really interesting, I mean, the conversations he and I have had alone are interesting. And that's why we were like, maybe we should start writing about this. Maybe we should start, recording these conversations that we have. And now we've sort of gotten to the point where it's like, oh, we should actually bring in guests, right? If we're going to talk about casting, let's talk to somebody from, theater. Let's talk to somebody from dance. But let's also talk to some managers. Like, how do you build your team, right?
Mm.
And see, are there parallels there? See, are there things that like are working really well in one world? that the other world just is completely oblivious to. I
Yeah.
think that's sort of because one of the things I was thinking about is like, okay, we're going to start this podcast. We're going to give conference talks. We've actually sadly been accepted to a few conferences, and neither of us could actually make it. Poor planning on our part, but yeah, if we're going to start talking about this, like, what's the value add? What's our core sort of thesis? And I think it's just that we have a unique perspective that very few people have, and it's like, how do we use that knowledge and that insight to really learn about and improve upon the ways that we do things in tech.
That is an incredible viewpoint to be having. I mean, we talk so often about what can you learn from other industries and other fields. And the one, in spite of saying that, the one that we always gravitate towards is architecture and construction and design, right? And there's so many parallels there. It's been very interesting doing this show, of speaking to all of these people who are musicians of some kind, and there is most certainly a relationship, I think, between people that work within product design as a whole, and creative performing arts and creativity. And in actual fact, Tom Kerwin, who we spoke to on the last episode, is also a dancer. He's a Lindy Hop.
Oh, cool.
And a swing DJ. There's definitely these sort of relationships. And I often think myself about what could I be bringing from music into design. But what I think I've ended up doing is actually the reverse. So I started to take the approach of things like in the bands that I was in before, we used to spend months and months and months crafting a song so that we could go out and play it at a show or put it onto an EP, and have started to take a little bit more of a DIY approach of things, that we'll get half an idea for a song and we'll go and play it to user test it. Mm-hmm. So we'll play it at a show and see what the reaction is. And if it's good, then we know we're kind of going in the right direction. So I haven't awesome. Quite found it to go the other way yet, but I'm sure that it will eventually.
Yeah. And, stay tuned. We'll hopefully we'll be sharing things that you can use.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk about a little bit more about your background, because you finished school with computer science and psychology.
Yes.
The crazy thing is it makes perfect sense as a combination if this is where you end up. But what was the intention there originally?
Yeah, I love telling this story, because when they're like, how'd you get into UX? It's like, well, I have to go back to when I was 17 and picking, which university to go to and what to study. So at the time, for some reason, I had decided that I was really interested in people and like why we do things and how we work. Like, that was just so fascinating to me. And I wanted to make video games, right? Because I was, 17, grew up, playing Nintendo and whatnot. So I was like, okay, like, I'm going to study computer science. I'm going to study psychology. And I really had no plan. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to make these, I didn't even know that the sort of user-centered design and human-computer interaction world, which is the academic half of what we know as UX design, I had no idea it existed until my junior year. So I wound up where I went. I went to school at the University of Rochester, and I picked that school specifically because they were really the only one of the universities that I talked to, applied to, had gotten accepted to, that said, oh yeah, you should come here and double major and study both. Like, it just was not even on my radar that you could do that. I was very much being told, like, oh, you need to pick an engineering school to study computer science, or like a liberal arts school to study psychology. And right. Rochester was the one that was like, come here, study both. People do it all the time. So and like, Rochester has this really interesting, unique curriculum where it's kind of choose your own adventure in a way. Like, there's one required class that everyone at the university has to take, which is a writing course. And aside from that, you have degree requirements and whatnot, but you kind of pick like what you want to take, and it allows you to follow your interests. So I think that flexibility of curriculum, certainly, I wouldn't have the dance career I have now had I not spent that time at Rochester, gotten into dance there, and, subsequently moved to Madison and joined the company there. But I think that flexibility was really important. So yeah, I was like studying computer science, studying psychology, doing research in both, with professors as research assistant, et cetera. And then my third year, we had an adjunct professor teach this like one-off intro to HCI course, intro to human computer interaction. And I was just like human computer interaction. What is this? Why have I never heard of this? And like, I kind of got mad at my advisor. I was like, why didn't you tell me? Like, how did you not know that, like, here's a student that's studying psychology and computer science? Maybe I should bring up HCI. And what it was is that the entire field of HCI, on an academic side, is really only about 20 years old, right? So the sort of like the first major text in, usability engineering by Jacob Nielsen was published, I believe, in like 1991 or 1993. Like, somebody fact checked that for me, but it's such a new field. So, at the time it was 2007, 2008, something like that. It's like it just hadn't even gotten out for a lot of academics and for a lot of
Mm.
people. There's still, to my knowledge, there's no such thing as an undergraduate degree in human computer interaction, right? Like, you have to study computer science and sort of specialize in HCI, which is what I wound up doing after I just, like, it completely changed my career trajectory, my like life. I was just like, whoa, this is amazing, right? This is this to study this sort of the overlap of human factors design and technology, in an academic sense, was really incredible. So that's sort of how I got down this path to begin with. We wound up hiring a full-time faculty member, Jeff Bigham, out of the University of Washington, as our first full-time faculty member in HCI. He started up an HCI lab, which I did some work with Jeff as well. He's still a great friend of mine, a good mentor. Um, yeah, it's like the whole thing is just snowball serendipity. Like, I couldn't have planned it, but the having an academic background in both psychology and computer science, and specifically HCI, has been incredibly useful throughout my career. I think it's one of the things that really, now that I'm a little bit more mature and sort of getting into the meat of my career, it's I think it's really interesting, and it's very much a differentiator for me, right? There are things that I sort of do and understand intuitively that people who, I mean, there are tons of different backgrounds in research, right? In UX design, you have architects, you have marketers, you have engineers, you have designers. Everyone comes to UX from a different place,
Mm.
but because of that, people don't necessarily have the understanding of, this is how you do research. This is, the statistical, methods that you could employ. I think it's really interesting. And that's one of the sort of side projects I'm working on as well, is that what are these, can we like make a sort of crash course in, social science, research methods, and like, hey, for everyone that didn't do this in college, here's a little boot camp that, here's some things you can do. Here's some things to think about. I think it would be tremendous to put that together and to really be able to give back to the community in that sense, and it would just elevate the level of research that we're all doing.
Kind of reminds me of Joe Leach, who's a user experience designer from the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Wrote a book, which I think is called Psychology for Designers. It's a really interesting read. It's very much trying to find the balance between that sense of sort of pseudoscience and pop psychology that kind of gets associated with human computer interaction, versus actually really thinking about psychology at a deeper level. It's definitely one that's worth having a read for anyone that hasn't picked that up. Tell me what you think about the current state of education. Obviously, in the US is probably your best frame of reference here for people that are moving into this new digital industry. Do you think we're setting people up with the right skills?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're obviously sort of all going through this revolution where, we may be one of the last generations that gets a college degree. Because if we're looking at, children that are being born now, like, are you even going to need to go to college for some of these, especially if you're going into the tech industry? Like, probably not, right? If I think about, I'm very, very grateful to have the background in computer science and like to have a bachelor's degree and really take that deep dive. But it's very rare that I use a lot of those skills and a lot of those things that I learned. So, I even tell some of the high school students that I have contact with, it's like, maybe take a year and don't go straight to college, right? Like, if you don't know what you want to do, take some time, do some exploring. I very much say to, rising and graduating seniors, like, don't go to grad school unless there's something that you found that's really, really interesting and you need to like study it further, right? There are a lot of people that will go to grad school because they're like, oh, I don't know what I want to do, or I can't really find a job. It's like, no, just go out and take some job and explore that way. Um, it's it's sort of always been, I think, this problem specifically in tech and in software where you study computer science or information technology or computer engineering, whatever it is,
Mm.
and then you go out into the industry and yeah, you just don't use what you're learning because that's not you don't need 4 years to learn how to write code. You don't need most of the code you write doesn't need a deep consideration of runtime analysis and of which data structure you're using. Like a lot of that stuff at this point has been abstracted away.
Mm.
I think what's really interesting is to think about, and I was just having this conversation with a friend last night, that more and more we're getting applications that leverage machine learning and that leverage sort of big data and whatnot. So it's like what are those skills, right, in the next 10, 20 years that software engineering, maybe no one's writing code anymore because we have code that writes code and it writes it better than any human ever would, right? It's faster, it's more efficient, it's whatever. It's completely illegible to us, but in its current state, I love making this point to sort of first, second year computer science students is like the code that you write isn't for the computer, it's for us, it's for people. Because when you write code, it eventually gets compiled down to some machine code that is actually executed. So the code you're already writing is for humans. So if we take the human out of the entire loop and it's an algorithm writing code for execution, like the entire nature of what it is to be a software engineer is going to change.
Yeah.
And it's already changing. So Google, I'm very slowly working through this, but Google has a sort of crash course in machine learning that they give to all of their engineers, and it's open source, it's online, like anyone can do it. It's about 15 or 20 hours worth of content, and it's like super cool. It's really interesting. And I mean, I think you have companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon investing heavily in these sort of machine learning tools for their workforce. So I think that's really the future. And one of the things that I do with Rochester now as an alum is that we have this sort of young alumni, recent graduate advisory council for our engineering school, where they're looking at us and saying, "You're out there, you're in the industry. Tell us what you're seeing. Tell us. We're there to give them feedback and to give them advice as to like, hey, here are trends that we're seeing. Here are things that maybe we should consider offering and supporting for our students."
So is that acting as the voice of industry?
Yeah, in many ways, and it's kind of like interesting and funny to have myself on the council because it's like, well, I work in tech. Obviously, I've had this crazy, worked with a bunch of different companies, done a bunch of startups. Like I've sort of been around and seen a lot of things, but it's like in the tech industry, like I'm not an engineer, right? Like I'm, I have a degree in computer science. I'm part of the engineering school, but I don't write code. I don't even design things anymore.
Yeah. You mentioned about having your own mentor.
Mhm.
Do you still have people that you work with as mentors?
I do. I found that it's not. It's like it's not a sort of. We're not on a schedule, I guess, is a good way to put it. There are people that when I'm looking for advice, when I'm maybe at a crossroads, I'll ask them for sort of perspective. I think
Mm.
it's interesting being in sort of the UX world because a lot of this is so brand new for everyone. My first few years out of college, I worked with a lot of different startups and got a lot of different experience very quickly. So it was kind of weird to go from like I'm just graduated to like now I'm at a senior level in terms of like UX design because I've done so much, I've seen so many different things, and now what I'm realizing is that 7, 8 years out of undergrad and into my career, there aren't very many people in the like pure research world that have more experience than I do. There's obviously some, but if we're looking at percentile, like I would love to see the statistics, but it just seems like there aren't people. Like I'm asking questions and everyone's like, "That's a really good question. Tell us what you find out."
Mm.
um, so it's interesting to be at a point where I can't necessarily ask others like, hey, what do you think about this? So it's a lot of, it's a lot of consulting with peers. It's a lot of talking to, professors and other individuals that maybe have a different perspective on things. It's talking to other people, because it's like we're in the research world facing a lot of like change management issues, right? Where it's like it's not necessarily about the craft; it's about how do we get people on board? How do we bring people along, this journey with us? So it's interesting to think about who the people, that I talk to, who are the people that I ask for feedback, and what are the types of questions that I ask them.
So, what other kinds of challenges do you experience with personal development at this stage in your career?
Yeah, it's a really good question. For me, it's sort of and this is one of the things that I sort of thought long and hard about as I was transitioning into a new role. I was like, okay, I'm leaving Prolific. That's not working out. It's not going in the direction I want it to go. And I thought, what do I want to do next? Like, do I want to continue to go down an individual contributor route where it's like, be a principal researcher, a research fellow, whatever that looks like at whatever company? Or do I want to try to go down this management track where it's like, yeah, you'll be a manager, you'll be a director, you'll be a VP. So I think that was the big question for me. That was sort of the crossroads of, which path do I go down? Do I try to do something maybe in the middle where there's a lot of the, quality standards and making sure that we're doing good work and doing it right, but also this like lead a team and build a practice. And, I think for me, that's the new arena. It's that, what does it look like to build a research team? How do we ensure quality? How do we make sure that we're all doing, similar research, that we have a similar, sort of standard of this is good research, that's not good research. There's a lot of really interesting conversations, happening around how do we document this, right? So like one of the big new things that I've gotten really sort of interested in and involved in the conversation is around these research repositories that I think are kind of brand new. And it's like, okay, you do a bunch of research, you maybe, produce a report, and then that report goes off into the ether more or less, right? And like maybe somebody reads it, maybe they don't. 6 months from now, you look at that and you say, oh yeah, I remember we did some research about this like onboarding thing, but what did we find, and what were we researching? What were the questions we had? So I think that's a really interesting, sort of new thing. And that's part of it for me, is like, okay, what are these like bleeding edge innovations and ideas in the research world that we're playing with? And what does it look like? What does it mean to, right? Like if I were to be the, director of research, what does that even mean, right? There are so few companies that have a position in a title like that, it's the Wild West, and we're trying to learn from, engineering organizations, from design organizations, but we are very much, starting from scratch here.
Yeah, it's definitely the whole research operations side of things is what has really sparked my excitement over the last year, and to address some of those really key questions around research of like the waste that can come from the way in which we report our observations and our findings and how they're distributed. And I think the repository stuff is something that is going to go through a good number of very fast iterations, as it already is, really. And hopefully it will only take a couple of months for people to realize that Airtable is not the silver bullet that they were expecting it to be for the werewolf that is research. But it's a good step in the right direction. There's like intention there. But yeah, there's already a lot of products starting to emerge that I find really interesting. Going back to what you were saying earlier about sort of the new technologies and new emerging skills to be picking up, machine learning is obviously a really big one of them. And been speaking to a company recently based in London that are using machine learning as a way to be able to effectively scrape an insight bank where it can start to pull out some of the concepts for that tagging and codifying of your research for you, which, I mean, that's pretty epic if that becomes a thing.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I think when we think about and talk about these research repositories, I think something that, I've been really interested in thinking a little bit about is like, it's sort of this two-sided problem, right? You need to get insights in, you need to get insights out. And it's like you need two separate systems for this, and something that can make the incoming part, the ingest, easier, I think is much more important than, like, because everyone's focusing on how do we get things out, how do we like capture and report, and it's like we know how to do that. Actually, we're pretty good at that. We have no idea how to get researchers to put their stuff into the system. So if we look at so everyone like talks about Polaris and Tomer Sharon's work. Because he's one of the first people that like really started pushing this idea. If you talk to some of the people that worked at WeWork, if you talk to Tomer himself, it's really the problem was getting research into the thing. So what they actually wound up doing, and this is a great idea, because this is exactly what academia has been doing for since the dawn of time, is that they would get interns and like sort of junior team members to do all of the coding. So it's like I would conduct, as a senior team member, I would design the study, I would conduct all the research, I would give a like, here's 2 or 3 bullet points from this interview, and then I would pass it off to a junior team member who would then code it and nuggetize it and put it into the system. Like, it's great if you have an army of interns.
Right.
For a lot of us, we don't have that. So are there ways that we can use machine learning and use this sort of deep learning to do that stuff for us? And I think, and if someone figures that out, that's going to be huge. That's going to be one of those things where it's like, I think it's honestly just piecing these things together. Like, we have speech to text, we have facial recognition, so we can detect sentiment in the text, we can detect sort of emotional expression on the face. So it's like, how do we tie all these systems together in a way that says, this person, you're furrowing your brow, so you're probably confused or frustrated, and here are the words that they're saying, and here's the screen that they're on. Like, how do you just like bring all these things together in a way that now, you conduct an interview and it nuggetizes it all for you? It'd be magic. And I think,
it would be pretty incredible. I think that my only worry with a lot of these things is there was a conference that I went to where someone was presenting from one of the only research companies that I know of for video games, and they were presented by eye tracking, and their whole focus was that their platform was doing sentiment analysis through eye tracking. And I think they might have like attempted the kind of like sweat gland type mode of like detecting certain things as well. It starts to sway very close towards over intellectualizing something that's really basic, which is, unfortunately, we're not all working on products that are really interesting or serve great human good. We're shifting stuff. We're trying to flog something. So how much understanding of like the psychology of or behavioral analysis do you really need to determine whether you can sell this thing or not? It's very difficult to sort of know at what point you should just go, are we going a little bit too far here into the amount of data that we're trying to gather for ultimately whether someone abandoned their shopping basket?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's a really sort of, in a way, sobering point, because everyone's like, oh, it's the future, like it'll be magic. There's always going to be, and eye tracking is one. So it's like, if there are a few, because a lot of, it's again like user-centered design, human computer interaction is a very young field. So we're borrowing methods from other, like from market research and from, so it's like, oh, eye tracking. It's like, that tells you almost nothing about, an interface and about what someone's thinking. And people are like, oh, we should do eye tracking studies. Like, no, we really shouldn't.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like the same thing with like Net Promoter Score, with like focus groups, is that there are ways you can use these things. There are ways that they can be useful. But when we borrow them sort of whole cloth from, marketing, and we say, let's do a focus group, like, no, it's not going to work. Right. Like, you can't focus group an interface, because everyone has different opinions. Everyone has different experiences with it. So it's interesting to like sort of watch the field mature and to figure out like, what are the methods that we can use? What's actually interesting? What's useful? And then of course you have the, like, in academia, what are you doing research for versus in the industry? It's like, we need to make decisions based on this versus this is really interesting. Like, I'm glad academia is doing interesting research, but for most of us, we don't care. Like, we need to know, do I go with option A or option B?
Yeah, it's a real challenge to find the balance of, we've said just within this conversation about the value that you get from looking at other fields and other industries and what can you bring into it. But there is always this risk of someone sees something, they try it once, fluke a positive result, and then suddenly the entire world has to do things in that way. And I often wonder whether that's how we actually ended up with personas in the first place. Totally legit marketing, advertising tool, works really great for that. And we keep trying to like fudge it to make it work for understanding user interaction behavior and stripping away these various different data points and things to the point where we just end up with something that's actually completely useless and, you know, gets made as part of a discovery project and then is never seen ever again.
Yeah, personas are very high on that list for me. I mean, there's a lot of, I think it's morphing into its own thing. I've seen a lot of, I forget what it's called, but it's essentially like instead of, demographic information, it's more behaviors. So it's like, oh, like this person, shops at, Trader Joe's or at Whole Foods twice a week. Like, okay, that's a behavior, and that may influence, how they make decisions. So I think, yeah, when we sort of borrowed it whole cloth from marketing, and we're like, yeah, they're 45, Caucasian, like that doesn't matter. That doesn't tell us anything about their behavior necessarily. Yeah. But to start looking at either using like psychographic data, like, oh, here's their, there's Myers-Briggs, here's their big five, here's their whatever. That I think has some interesting potential. And then looking at behaviorally, what are the things that they do? When I give people the like 3-second version of what is user research, it's like, don't ask them what they think, ask them what they do, or observe what they do. Right? It's like, it's that interesting sort of struggle. But yeah, personas are another one of those things that it seems that everyone's like, we need personas, and I'm like, no, you really don't. Do you need user segments? Do you need to understand the different use cases? Maybe, that has potential depending on the application, but you don't need you don't need to give it a name and a face and all of that, right? Like, right. We've all tried that and it just doesn't work.
I think that's why I kind of like the concept behind jobs to be done format, because it's stripping all of that crud away and just saying, this is the thing that someone needs to do, and it doesn't matter who they are. And I think that's the other thing that I really like about it is I've always had an argument with the creation of personas of that there is only ever one, and it's just different points in time that one persona needs different things. The idea of when you go in and you have a team and they go, well, here's our 5 personas, but they're just derivatives of one, and you can spot that core one, and then all the others are just like, oh, and this is when they have this particular scenario. It's that like case in point.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what's interesting, one of the things that I brought up, I believe during my interview here with 1010, and haven't really had the chance to explain this further for people here, but it's like I brought up jobs to be done as something that's like, maybe because there are a lot of different people that use this platform for a lot of different things. I'm sure marketing has personas. We have target customers and whatnot, but I think from a product standpoint, that job to be done framework is going to be tremendously useful for us here. And thinking about how do people use the software, what are they trying to accomplish? There's this really, really great little like YouTube video, probably from a TED Talk or something, where I don't know if he's like one of the sort of creators or innovators that came up with this jobs to be done framework, but he was talking about doing research around breakfast foods for McDonald's or some big company like that. And he would go into one of these restaurants and he would ask people like, what job are you hiring that smoothie to do for you? And everyone looks at him like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, you bought this versus the like egg sandwich or whatever. Like, so you hired this to do a job. What job is that? And it's just such a like really funny way to like think about your breakfast food.
Yeah.
Like, what job are you hiring this for?
When I want to feel full, I go with smoothie.
Yeah. Have you seen it? Because it's really interesting, the end result.
I haven't. I'm going to have to look this up. I will add it into the show notes and everyone can check it out. What do you see as the things that you are going to have to pick up quickly in this new environment and new world of building a team and the concept of growth?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think it's going to be really interesting. One, sort of learning the culture here. What is the culture around how we work, how we interact, what are the things that this company values in individuals and in building a team. That's certainly going to be part of it. I'm in the middle of reading a book called Principles by Ray, I believe, Dalio, or however you pronounce it. Really, really incredible book. So he's the founder of Bridgewater Capital.
Right.
It's like one of the world's largest investment, and he's working. So he wrote this one book. He's writing another one for his sort of business and like economic principles. But the whole process that he's gone through in his career is that Bridgewater has built this incredible business, and they sort of have this like radical meritocracy idea where it's like it's not about who's in charge or whatever. It's like whoever has the best idea and can argue for it in the best way and convince everyone else. That's sort of because it's all economics, it's all finance. But what he discovered, as they sort of built out that team, is that not everyone sort of shares his way of thinking. So he would walk into a situation and like, oh, like you're wrong about this, or like, he's a person that, and I see a lot of the way that I interact in the way that he describes is he's like, tell me if I'm wrong, like just be completely honest and straightforward with me, because at the end of the day, it's going to be better, right? Like I'm going to learn, and we're going to get where we need to get faster. There are a lot of things about that are really interesting and really appealing to me. So I'm reading, and the solution is like, okay, people, in order for people to understand how you think and sort of how you're going to react in situations, develop these principles, write them down, and then sort of iterate on them, right? So it's like, if I run into this situation, here's a guiding principle about my behavior, about my thought process. And if as you encounter new situations, you kind of adapt and you say, oh, is this accurate? Is this the right principle? Um, so I'm really, really enamored with that idea just in general. But I'm thinking about, for me, as I build out a team, as I build out a practice, what's the sort of culture that we want to have on the research team, right? Like there's obviously the entire company's culture, but I think within each department and within each team, you have your own sort of culture, your own way of working. And it's really, I mean, it's just like, it's such an interesting idea. It's something that I really, really do want to try to put into practice and to see if we can have this, very principled way of working where, what, hey, this is what we believe. This is how we make decisions. This is what's important to us. I think it's really, really interesting. So it's very much going to be the Wild West in a lot of ways for me. It's first time really building out a team from scratch. First time figuring out what are the different methods and standards. And I mean, a lot of what's going to happen at 1010, especially at first, and I've already discovered this, like we have a lot of people here. So, I don't know if you've heard the sort of acronym or the term that's floating around the industry right now, but it's like we're researchers, right? But there are also people who do research.
Mm-hmm.
There's like this whole other class of support staff, product managers, sales, marketing, whatever.
So the people that are there, they're engaged with the customer, but they don't realize how much knowledge they have to share.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. People that are already talking to end users, people that are out there, like, yeah, they interact with customers on a daily basis, maybe in a different context. Maybe they're, support staff and they're trying to figure out what's the best way to help someone get their job done. But, really thinking about who are all these people at this organization? There's a ton of them. How are they capturing insights? How are they sharing those insights? I had a conversation with one of our solutions consultants or solutions architects, I believe on a few days ago, where he was like, oh yeah, like I at one point gathered a bunch of feedback and sent an email to our VP of product at the time with like, here's a bunch of things that I've heard, just wanted to get those out there. And I was like, that's great. It's great that you thought about that. It's great that you like actually wrote it down and sent it to someone, but like now that's just an email in like 3 people's inboxes,
Right.
and that's it. It's not,
You've lost it.
yeah, exactly. It's getting back to this sort of idea of like a repository or some sort of way to capture all of this information and get the company. People are already doing research. People are already talking to customers. How do we sort of get that at a level where everyone's happy with it, and then how do we scale that across the entire organization where anytime anyone talks to a customer and they have a suggestion or have some feedback, it goes somewhere. They know where it goes. So I think those are the two big challenges for me right now, is that, figuring out what that looks like for the company, and then starting to think about, how do we build a team? How do we, scale? What does culture look like? What are the how do we want to interact with each other? And how do I need to, maybe, I do want to adapt some of the principles from the book and sort of come up with my own, but to really codify, like, this is how we make decisions. This is how we, move forward.
I don't know whether it originates from that. Good friend of mine, Mikey Allen, who is a incredibly talented designer, shared with me the concept of group contracting. He was doing similar things of building out a design team and explaining that it was essentially this way of for all of you to get together as your team to talk about ways of working, but not in that very dry classic way of like, and this is how we conduct ourselves, but more leaning off of that concept of creating design principles that you would have for your product or the way that you like face out, to be about how you react and behave to one another within the team to start developing that culture. It's a really interesting concept, and for me it does feel like if we're to grow and develop as a field in research and start to become more of a very prominent presence in companies, we have to be adopting these principles ourselves, right, to be able to then permeate it to everybody else so that it becomes part of that norm. And I think it's just going to take time.
Yeah, no, I think, well, it's so interesting to be part of the, this research ops community now, because it's all of these people that are thinking the same things and having the same problems. And it's sort of, we're all coming together of like, one of the things that I'm involved in that community is this like skills framework, right? Where I was the one, because even when I was at Prolific, was sort of working on building a team there. And it's like, okay, how do we define a junior versus a senior researcher? Like, what are the expectations? What are the sort of, what sort of skills and experiences and whatnot should you have at different levels? And if you come in as a junior, what's the, trajectory and what are the career paths you can have? And I think it's just, when I talk about the field of user experience research, like the title user researcher really didn't exist, even as few as 5 years ago. My first few jobs were UX lead or product manager, or like nobody knew what to call us. So there are a lot of people that were doing research and were acting as what are now researchers with UX designer or like whatever title you had. So it's not at all surprising to me that, like, yeah, we're still trying to figure out as an industry, as a field, what these things are and how we work. And, but to your point, like the sooner we can do that, the sooner that the rest of sort of our colleagues can understand what it is we do and how to interact with us and what to expect. I was having a conversation with a few colleagues a few days ago where, colleagues, and so not at my company, but other researchers, where it's like, there seems to be a really big disconnect between what research is and can deliver and sort of what, other people at the company and in other fields think. And they're like, oh, you're a researcher, like you can come in and fix everything. And it's like, no, we can help you learn more. We can make suggestions, but we can't fix your entire product for you. And it's also going to take some time. We can't just fly in and within, 3, 4, 8 weeks, whatever, like, oh, ta-da, everything's better now. Like, it takes time to sort of get these things going. So it's really interesting to think about what's the root cause there. Like, why is there such a disconnect? And I think it is that we as a field haven't yet crystallized like what it is we do and how we deliver value and how we interact with different parts of the business, right? Like, how do we interact with marketing? How do we interact with engineering? How do we interact with, our support staff? Like, I think there's an answer to all those questions, and it's going to be a little bit different per company, but I think as a whole, we just don't know. So it's like, is your research team, where do they even sit in the company? Are they under product and with the product managers? Are they with the design team? Are they under like the technology branch as a whole? Like, And it's different. Every company's different. We don't know yet.
And all of those things are so messy anyway. There's so many. I mean, I've been in service design teams that are within IT, and I just can't understand why they're sat within an IT department when they're supposed to be the bridge between technology and people. And that no one has really got that right at the moment. So I wonder, thinking about what you're saying there, if the reason why defining what user research does is so difficult is the fact that we are in the second wave of what we created as an industry in user experience design. Because for me, it feels like there was a tipping point where user experience design was the thing that you talked about, but a week before whenever that mythical day was, you were a web designer and you were responsible for making this thing. But there were certain people, and I'd like to think that I was one of them, that kept asking why we were making it that way. And so it was the research element, and it is still today very difficult to sell the concept of research. We've created a rod for our own backs because we use this user research, user experience hook to be able to sell research. And now we're trying to decouple it again and have it as a standalone entity.
Yeah, well, it's everything you said is like it's so interesting, right? Because when people ask again about my sort of career trajectory, I came out of undergrad like knowing that I wanted to go into UX. Like I had found the holy grail, human computer interaction, learned that in industry it's called user experience design. So I thought, great, I'll go into design, and I was doing design jobs and the things that we do as designers, and I kept sort of wondering like, well, is this the right thing? And especially working with startups where you probably don't have the time and the budget and whatever to do proper research. So they would say, okay, come in and like make us some mock-ups for this sign up flow. And I said, okay, I can do that, but who's signing up and like why? It was always all these whys. And they're like, just do it. We'll figure it out later. I said, okay. I made some designs, and then I came back to them and said, I took a guess. I don't know if this is the best idea. I don't know if it's going to work. We should go test this. We should get some feedback. And they would say, oh, no, we don't have time for that. We're just going to build it. I'm just looking at them like, I have some knowledge and some expertise, and there are like guidelines and heuristics I can follow, but I could be completely wrong here. And until we go out and test it, you're betting the farm on like my random guess, more or less.
Right.
So that having that experience over and over again is really what drove me to research and to being like, you know what, I'm so tired of designing in a vacuum. I'm tired. I'm tired of people writing code in a vacuum. I'm tired of designing in a vacuum. You cannot research in a vacuum. It is like by definition and by nature, getting out of the room, getting out of these four walls and talking to people and seeing what they want and seeing what they don't want. And really, trying to build an understanding as to what is it they're trying to accomplish? What are the things that they, how are they going to use this product? It's like, and the point about like how do you sort of market and sell research? It's like, I wish I had an answer. If I had an answer, we would all be better for it, and I would be a very, very rich individual because it's a problem that we all face. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about and sort of reflecting on is Nielsen Norman Group has this like corporate UX maturity scale that they've come up with, through their research, where it goes 1 to 8, and they sort of tell you, okay, at step 2, this is a description of, what the qualities are, what the characteristics are, and here's what you need to do to get from 2 to 3. And they do that all the way through, 1 through 8. And level 1, step 1 is, it's like either hostility towards or like complete ambivalence towards research and towards you being user centered. And the recommendation at level 1 is get out.
Yeah.
They're basically like, you can't convince a company and convince executives to care about research and to care about the end user. So until they get burned enough times, they're just going to keep doing what they do. And I think the sad part is that some companies have found success. They've won the lottery, basically, right? They're like, we built a thing, it happens to be working. We don't need research. And it's just like, oh, this is a time bomb.
Yeah.
It's just like waiting to explode. And it's going to be a glorious explosion when it happens. Um, but yeah, it's whenever, if someone ever figures out how to like really sell and like really convince people that research matters, it's going to be incredible. But until then, we're kind of stuck in this like, we think it's important. We have to try to convince you that it's important. And that's a big reason why, I left my previous position and joined this company, is that they were the ones, like 1010 was saying to me, like, we need research. We need someone that can come in and like really help us here. Like, we're fully committed. This is, full steam ahead on this. And I said, that's great. Because right now I'm fighting uphill battles internally and I'm just tired of it. That's not what I'm here to do.
It's an incredibly draining experience to be in, and more so when there is actually a sense of it's wanted, but there's the fear of what you get told, what the answer is. And I think that there's still a lot of companies that profess to being pro user-centered design, but are still actually just scratching their own itch, and they will manipulate the way in which they report findings and statistics to gather confirmation bias effectively.
Oh yeah, I've seen it, dozens of times, and it's really distressing, right? Like I've reached a point in my, career and in terms of maturity where there are times where you go out, you do research, you get some results, and you present them to your executives, your product team, wherever, and they look at that and say, we still think we're going to do this other thing. And you're like, okay, if you want to ignore the data, like by all means, that's your decision. I'm not here to make decisions. I'm here to discover and share insights.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is that you have researchers at companies that will find something and say, oh, if I present this, like someone's going to be upset. So I'm just not going to present it. Like that to me is such I personally could not work in that environment. It's like, against my sort of professional integrity to do something like that. And I've sort of counseled colleagues and peers that are in that situation where they're like, I found this, but if I say that, I'm going to get in trouble. What do I do?
Right.
And it's tough, right? It's like you're in some ways risking your job to do the right thing.
Is this a risk which comes from the challenges with impartiality of whether you're in-house or agency, or have you experienced it on both sides?
I've seen it in both cases, and the most recent one was actually at an agency. It was somebody that was working at an agency. I think it depends on the nature of the agency, right? So one of the things that I sort of struggled with on my way joining Prolific is that I've always been in that situation that you had described, where it's like you're an agency, you're brought in to be the expert, and like it's okay if you tell somebody that they're wrong. That's kind of why you're there. Whereas my work with Prolific, it's much more like relationship management. It's sort of a like I came in guns ablazing. I was wrong. I was very much wrong in that case, but I was just like, I'm here to like make research a thing at Prolific, and like I don't care who I have to lay waste to get to that point. And what I learned very quickly and discovered is that like no, not all consultancies, not all agencies work in this like we're the expert, we're telling you what to do way. Some places you have to do a lot of that relationship management side, which is something that I'm personally not great at. And it's partly that I'm not interested in that. I don't necessarily want to be in those positions, but yeah, it's not the case that everyone, you can just come in and say, hey, you're wrong, I'm right, and here's why. There's going to be, at the end of the day, we're human, right? Everyone's human. We're going to be dealing with humans. One of the things that I learned and really do appreciate from my time at Prolific is that it doesn't matter how good you are or how right you are. You need to be able to communicate that to your audience in a way that they can understand and that they can accept. So yeah, it's I've seen it in both cases, sadly, but it is sort of comes with the territory.
Will you wear the scars well? Think about across your entire career, both in research and design and in dance as well. What's the best piece of advice you've been given?
I think the most important thing for me, and this is something that has come from my career in dance. There are a lot of things that, we as researchers and designers, obviously we care a lot about the work that we do. Are we doing the right thing? Are we, showing up, etc. But as a dancer, it is very much about, you and your artistry and your technique and whatnot. And it's, for better or for worse, and whether or not anyone shows it, all dancers have this like tremendous sort of imposter syndrome going on all the time. You would never know. And there are people that like cover it up by being the, prima donna, whatever, like, oh, I'm so amazing. But like everyone at their core is like, oh, am I doing it right? Am I good enough? And the director of Canopy Dance Company in Wisconsin, Lisa Thurell, would always say to me, she was like, you know what, you just have to show up and put in the work, right? Like whatever you're doing, don't focus on whether you're doing right or not. Like obviously take some time to reflect on that, but you just got to show up and put in the work, right? If you as a dancer, like you have to be in rehearsal, you have to put in that time, you have to go to class, you have to like constantly be working. It's just, and when people ask me, they're like, how do you, what's it like being a professional dancer? How did you do this? And it's like, well, you show up and you put in the work, right? It all comes down to just that dedication to the craft, that sort of attention and focus and care. But it's also just about, how many reps you get in, how much time you spend. One of the things that I've written about for performing design, and I really want to explore more, is like we don't do any sort of daily exercises in research or in design. You sort of learn your skills and then you go out and you produce. But how often do we work on our technique? How often do we, I take, a dance class pretty much every day, anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. I'll be in rehearsal anywhere from, 4 to 8 hours, depending on the day, and sort of where we are in production. And it's like, how often do you spend that time working on your craft in design or in research? So I think that's, just put in the work. I just show up, put in the work, smile, things like that. But it's like, it all comes down to, you got to show up.
What a wonderful thought to finish up on.
Yeah.
Brad, thank you so much for taking part today. And I sincerely hope that we hear from you again with your own podcast.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get that started. We're very much we're like wrapping up the planning phases. We're starting to schedule, starting to line up speakers, starting to figure out what our tech setup's going to look like, how we're going to distribute. We're sort of going through those motions right now, but we have a framework. We're going to sort of revamp our website, and, we're going to have the blog for content. We're going to have the podcast, and then we're going to sort of have this like conference materials, whatever it may be. To sort of get these ideas out there and see how people react to it. It's something that always, anytime I talk about it, people are like, whoa, that's crazy. Tell me more. Like there's a lot of interest in it. So I think that's pretty exciting. And yeah, we just kind of have to find and make the time to commit to it and get things going.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the UX Coach. If you're new here, you can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere else that you can get your feeds from. You can also sign up to our monthly newsletter featuring the best posts from around the world on digital careers and practices. We really want to give a voice to the often unheard stars of this field. So if you'd like to join the conversation on digital design and research careers, get in touch with us at our website, theuxcoach.com. I'll be back in a few weeks with another guest to talk about their experiences of navigating digital design and the new opportunities that are ahead for us. Until then, come and talk to us on Twitter at the UX Coach Pod, and I'll see you in a few weeks.